Hi, my name is Lexi Thurston, and this is my oral book report for the class Environmental Science for Dr. Robert Lovely. The book I chose to read was The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert. The book was published in 2014 by Henry Holtz and Company. The book is a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the book has 13 chapters without the prologue at the beginning and the acknowledgments at the end. A little bit more about the author. She was a journalist and an author, obviously. She had written 2 other books besides The Sixth Extinction. One was Field Notes from a Catastrophe, Man, Nature, and Climate Change, and the other was The Prophet of Love and Other Tales of Power and Deceit. The setting of this book is all over the world, almost in every continent. The book has 2 parts, the past and the present. The first part tries to highlight past extinctions and how we have gotten to where we are today, and highlights over the 500 million years. And then part 2 is more her present journey, traveling around the world to study these species that have gone extinct or are currently struggling and going to become extinct. A few topics in the book is obviously the extinction of the many different species that she covers. She covers why mass extinction or extinction has occurred in general, whether it be global warming, ocean acidification, deforestation, asteroid hitting the Earth, or human activity, which is mainly what she's talking about for mass extinction number 6, which we are currently in the process of. And then she talks about the Anthropocene approach, which is what we're currently in right now. To summarize the chapters, chapter 1 is the 6th extinction. It takes place in Panama and El Valley. It covers the golden frog extinction and how cichrids, a new type of fungus, had taken out that species and actually many species of frogs in general. Amphibians are the most endangered class of species right now, and other classes are not far behind them. Chapter 2 is the Macedonian molars. The author interacts with George Cuvier, which is a naturalist, the discovery of the American mastodon was actually the first thought of extinction. Before that, it was deemed impossible. This was in the 1700s. The bones they found were similar to elephants and hippos, but they were sure because of the molars of the mastodon. So it was a huge debate on what the remains were, and actually shortly after there were 3 other species of bones that were found, including a species of giant sloth. And by the 1800s, there was 23 species in the Museum of Natural History, including giant bears, giant frogs, and even flying reptiles. And many of these people studying these species had agreed that humans were the cause of their extinction. Chapter 3 talks about the original penguin, or the great auk. The author discussed Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin and the theory of natural selection and evolution, and without Lyell there would have been no Darwin. And the extinction of the great auk actually put a pause in the theory of evolution. The author travels to Iceland, where the great auk was last known. And in Iceland, there was millions of great auk when they were first discovered, but unfortunately, settlers ate them, used them for oil, fish bait, and stuffed their mattresses with their feathers. So ultimately, humans were the cause of their extinction. They were gone by 1844, and during the search for great auks, any surviving, Newton, one of the naturalists from the 1800s, put a ban on hunting during mating season. And this made Darwin aware of human-caused extinctions after discovering that humans had taken out the great auk. Chapter 4 is called The Luck of the Amatides. This chapter discussed the dinosaur extinction, which was the extinction that occurred right before the time we're in now. 75% of all species were taken out. A 6-mile-wide asteroid had hit Rome, and this is where the chapter takes place. It described the asteroid hitting the Earth as 100 million tons of TNT exploding, and that actually wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the dust that rose after the asteroid had hit, and Amanides actually made it through. They were a type of mollusk that lived in the ocean, which is where most of the species that survived lived. But it was noted that they actually went extinct after due to humans. And this showed that in times of extreme distress, fitness is relevant. So Darwin's theory of natural selection was also kind of thrown up in the air, like, okay, well, humans are actually the cause of extinction now, not fitness. And it also showed that evolution cannot make it through abrupt change, like climate change and an asteroid hitting the Earth. Chapter 5 is called Welcome to the Anthropocene. The chapter takes place in Scotland, and it was discovered that there's intervals of mass extinction, and it takes place about every 26 million years. It also explains why the current time period we're in is called Anthropocene. Right now, humans are in charge, and every decision we make affects every species around us, and it's all human-centered, and that's why now the time we're in is basically human-centered. We have cut down forests and caused deforestation. The CO2 levels in our atmosphere and in our oceans are higher than they have ever been. And this is mostly due to burning of fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, and coal. And this is continued into Chapter 6, the sea all around us. It goes into more depth of fossil fuels and CO2 in the air. Fossil fuels have contributed 365 billion metric tons of CO2 into the air, and deforestation has put 180 billion metric tons of CO2 into the air. And the CO2 is absorbed by the ocean. Approximately 1/3 of the CO2 is absorbed, and the ocean absorbs 2.5 billion tons yearly and about 7 pounds daily of CO2. And for some species will thrive, and others will die off and struggle due to the CO2 increase or pH level decrease in the ocean. And this is where the continuance into Chapter 7 of dropping acid, where it highlights the importance of coral reefs and how CO2 causes calcifiers not to be able to build their exoskeleton. 9 million species interact with the coral reef, and inevitably by 2050 there will only be coral reef patches, and 9 million species at some point in their life interact or survive because of the coral reef. And all these species will need to adjust now, because ultimately, if humans don't change their behavior, the coral reefs will disappear. And it will be the first major ecosystem to disappear in our time. For animals to keep up with the change in acidification, they would need to move 30 feet a day, which is ultimately impossible. And there's multiple things that are taking out coral reefs. Dynamite fishing, overfishing, runoff, deforestation, and ultimately climate change. Then chapter 8 is called The Forest and the Trees. It highlights that, yes, global warming is taking out our Arctic Circle, and polar bears and penguins are in danger, but global warming will too affect our major tropical forests and trees in general. So the chapter takes place in Peru, and the author goes and observes 17 plots, and then observes the climate change effects, because each plot is on a different level of the mountain with different temperature changes, and they observe how each species adapts to temperature change. They explain greater diversity, greater effect. And by 2050, as I was saying, by 2050, many of these species may not even be here. There's a 24% average decrease right now of species. They must adapt 10 times faster. Otherwise, there will be a restructure of entire ecological communities. Chapter 9 is Island on Dry Land. It takes place in the Amazons, close to Venezuela. This covers the world's largest and most important running experiment. They explain that there's no virgin land on the earth. At some point or another, there has been human interaction, and they have marked their territory in some way or another. They also explain the difference between local extinction and global extinction, and how local extinction must come first, and inevitably it will most likely become global extinction eventually. And they highlight that the smallest change can make the biggest difference in a community environmentally. Chapter 10 is called The New Pangea. Most of the chapter takes place in New York, where they study bats. 6 million bats have gone extinct due to white fungus powder, which was actually imported from humans from Europe. Chapter 11 is called The Rhino Gets an Ultrasound. Mostly takes place in the Cincinnati Zoo. The first part of the chapter is about a rhino, Sumatran rhino, I'm sorry if I said that wrong, named Suki. Rhinos have an unpredictable mating cycle, which makes it very hard for them to get pregnant in captivity. And ultimately, rhinos have gone extinct due to habitat shrinkage from deforestation and grassland shrinkage. They were hoping to rebuild the rhino population, and they caught 40 rhinos, and only 7 survived, I believe. And not only that, only 3 rhinos ended up actually producing babies, and it wasn't until 2000. I put a quote: "You humans brought the species so low that it only seems only heroic human efforts can save it," because ultimately this is the same for all large animals: elephants, large cats, bears, and hippos. They didn't have any predators in the wild because they were too big to eat. And then came along human settlement, and ultimately we wiped out all the large animals that were left in the wild. Chapter 12 is The Madness Gene, and this was one of my favorite chapters, actually. It talks about Neanderthals and how large they were, and how they probably would crush a human with their fist if they were still alive. Once again, settlement of humans lines up with their extinction, and most humans, not African Americans, are up to 4% Neanderthal from interspecies mating. They would be our closest living relatives if they were alive, but apes and chimps are our closest living relatives, which chimps are facing extinction. They've had a 50% drop since I want to say it said like 1970, and same for gorillas, except they've had a 60% decrease in population, and yet we're still out here as humans capturing gorillas and apes to do experiments to ultimately better humans when we're literally taking away their habitat and killing them. All these animals would ultimately still be living if it weren't for humans. And then chapter 13 is The Thing with Feathers. It takes place in San Diego, where they're studying a bird like a crow, but it's more beautiful, one of the most beautiful birds in the world. They actually save cells of species that's gone extinct, and they keep them in the frozen zoo at the San Diego Zoo. And they do experiments where they try to bring back these species. And it's kind of odd, but people took extinction seriously too late, and ultimately thousands of species have gone extinct because of this. And human extinction is ultimately the big cause of extinction in general. Yes, there's climate change, and yes, there's CO2 in the air, but this all results back to humans, and measures must be taken before ultimately we are the problem of our own death. Like, the chapter explains that if we don't change, we will kill ourselves ultimately in the end. Not anytime soon, but yeah, that's the end of the summaries. The main objectives that the author wanted to get across is to exemplify the human effect, and they definitely accomplished that. Humans have changed this earth ultimately very negatively, and it's all about humans. We need to make sure that this earth is home for all the species out there, not just humans. They want another objective I believe the author had was to bring worry to the author, or to the readers, and they definitely did that for me. I've always been worried for animals, and for humans, I don't want to die because of decisions over the last 100 years that ultimately could have been made different. What worked? This was a pretty easy read, I'd say. There wasn't any really big words. There is some words that I can't pronounce. I did look up how to say them, but it's just hard for me to say. It was actually pretty interesting to read that while the author was, experiencing this firsthand, she traveled all over the world for research on these species and ultimately discovered that humans are cruel. They used lots of pictures in the text, which was really nice. I've always enjoyed that, but it was nice to see some of the bones and the DNA and some of the shells. And yeah, what didn't work was she did a lot of bouncing around during the chapters. Like, she would be in the past talking about Charles Darwin or Charles Lyell, and then all of a sudden she'd be in the forest searching for species that have survived, and it was just a little bit confusing to keep track of that, and it was a bit repetitive, like I think maybe 3 or 4 chapters were like continuing on from one another, which was kind of okay, but it was kind of hard to keep track. Some themes of the book, obviously extinction, mass extinction, and human-related extinction. That was basically addressed in every single chapter. And another theme would be environmental changes and climate change. It talks about the 5 mass extinctions that have gone on and how over 50% of species gone extinct in each time, and we continued on and we've thrived from nothing, and now humans are alive and it's only about humans and we've changed the environment as a result of this. I believe the intended audience would be anybody at a college level that can read well, or honestly, I would have not been surprised if this book would have been assigned for an environmental science book class, because as we were getting lectures and reading in the textbook, the book was going right along and adding to it. So I would honestly, I would recommend this book to anybody that wants to learn more about the environment or has been concerned about the environment and wants to know like what humans have done over the years to affect these species. And they definitely changed some ideas that I had in my head. I always knew climate change and cutting down trees was bad, but I didn't realize how many species actually have gone because of this. And I would need to change my behavior so that ultimately I don't die or my grandkids don't die, because CO2 is still being put into the air and the ocean is still absorbing it, and species will continue to die. But yeah, I recommend this book definitely to anybody who's concerned about the environment or wants to learn more about what humans have done. It's a great read and pretty easy, and yeah, thank you.